The next speaker is Wayne Heimer, who's retired from Alaska Department of Fish and Game. Wayne has been a major player in this organization for a very long time, and it's an honor to have him on board for this session. And he is not going to use a PowerPoint presentation. So we're going to get to hear him speak directly.
Okay, we think this is it. Welcome to the Living History and Philosophy section of our symposium. I allege I've been at the symposium for all but 2 meetings, and I've cluttered up at least 22 of our biennial meeting proceedings with a chapter on what's going on in Alaska. I know throughout the presentation I should be saying Dall's sheep, but I'm so old that I never quite made that transition. So I hope you'll bear with me, as well as bearing with me with my tendency to think I might have found out something that would be useful to you. I think Alaska's sheep management history should be written down somewhere. I think this is as good a place as any. The reason I think that is because I think everything is caused by something. Management is always where it is because something that's already happened. That is, it's primarily reactive, even if you have a management plan. And I think the background of how we got where we are might help us someday in a solution. That's what's in this for me. It may be kind of a bizarre ego trip, but that has happened before. My real question is, as I think about this, what's in it for you? And I think it could be the message that management, where the rubber meets the road, in spite of management plans to define future management, is more complex than gathering data and formulating regulations. In Alaska, I've argued that management exists of intervening in an established system, anyone, to produce or maintain and enhance a predefined benefit. In wildlife management, this typically happens through regulation. Alaska's predefined benefit is the Alaska Constitution. It calls for maximum sustainable benefit, historically for consumptive use, because that was the use when the Constitution was written in 1959. The ethic hasn't changed an awful lot, but it calls for sustainable benefit for Alaskans and for the Alaskan economy. The most basic thing that I think puts us in general wild sheep management at a disadvantage is that wild sheep and maybe goats, Steve, kind of missed out on management as a priority when wildlife management was invented. There weren't a lot of them around in the first third of the 20th century. Those critters that were worth managing included the cervids, the canids, the ursids, and small game. And they became priorities because of the economic contribution to conservation. It wasn't until wild sheep began to recover, primarily from reduced environmental resistance that had to do probably with livestock, that their economic importance began to rise in priority. For those of us who've been around a long while, we've seen things get better. Along the way, I've seen it in a fantastic way in Alaska, where I used to be the single biologist, both research and management, for Dall sheep. It was pretty tenuous. I was kind of the guy that was expected on the ground to think those things up, but there were, of course, classically trained bosses in the public to consider, and it was a little bit rough and tumble. I think we have made a lot of progress because of the broader application or appreciation of economic benefits to Alaskan economy, or maybe just because I'm a stubborn SOB when it comes to Dall sheep priority. Today, Alaska's Department of Fish and Game supports 2 full-time Dall sheep research biologists, technical field assistants, some graduate students, and designated management biologists. Management duties are carried out by about a dozen area management biologists who do survey and inventory, reporting, planning, and regulation for their areas. I estimate the budget at about $250,000. The return on that to the economy of the state is approximately 80 times past that. While I'm gratified that things are still better than I'd ever hoped, management in Alaska is still rather complex because of where we've been. Our earlier idyllic neglect of Dall sheep as a priority has rather rendered Dall sheep management as a traditional free-for-all. Local input has been very important. The reason local input is so important is that in territorial days, all management decisions were made in Washington, D.C. and were top-down and unappealable. When we came to statehood, we established a citizens board, which I think is analogous to your game commissions or whatever, which makes this citizens board makes management in Alaska a particularly interesting proposition, because Alaska is a younger state where professional managers can still be pushed around by the public through the Board of Game. After all, that's why our Board of Game exists. I have a couple stories I want to tell you to illustrate the nature of management complexity in Alaska, and maybe you'll pick up something along the way. The first story is about the most recent resident revolt in Alaska. Started about 8 years ago, but we are still living with the effects today. Alaska's Dall sheep still exist in primarily basic, pristine conditions. They're unexploited, but habitats, while potentially at risk, are generally remote enough to be little spoiled. Human harvests are light, and natural environmental controllers like weather and predation seem to be the check on populations. However, you never know what's going to happen next, either biologically or on the user side of the equation. I think that's why we have management plans. We have management plans to provide guidance for managers and hopefully to assure the public of effects for a certain future. Now, our first management plans were finalized in 1976 by our Board of Game. Those of us who were on staff all those years ago, I was a rookie at the time, were told, make management plans. We didn't know exactly why, other than know that management plans were kind of trendy at the time. They were emerging. Nobody bothered to explain to us that management plans were to stabilize the future perturbations in the existing system. Consequently, the management planning of 1974 was slanted toward intuitive common sense to preserve what we were doing at the time. Now, living with the heritage of public involvement, we thought we should probably ask the public what it wanted from its Dall sheep resource. So we crafted one of the very early hunter attitude surveys to find out what Dall sheep users wanted, the hunters that was in those days, for the future assurance of opportunity. We found out the things they wanted were opportunity to always go sheep hunting, to hunt in the mountains, have the mountains all to themselves, and to kill a monster ram. This seemed simple enough because we had done a horn growth study in 1973, which kind of defined how it was that various populations existed in abundance and population quality. For the maximum opportunity to hunt goal, we chose areas with lots of sheep and good access. You might not find great sheep there, and it might be crowded, but you can always go. Next, we had zones where high aesthetic values that hunters described were to be created and maintained. These had better sheep of higher quality, maybe not quite so many, and fewer hunters, which required limited entry permits. Then we had trophy areas where we had age and size horn limits and permits. Our first full curl management area was that in that column, and it influenced later regulatory size regulations, and that's another story. These management plans worked great for about 15 years, and then in the 1990s, sheep populations began to fluctuate, which we had not anticipated. They'd been stable for a long time. Weather seemed the most likely cause because it changed, seemingly because of who knows what. My favorite is a rise in surface temperature of the North Pacific that results from Hawaii volcanoes spewing 7,000 degree lava into the Pacific current. Now I think we call that La Nina, over the course of about 40 years. Whatever. When populations began to fluctuate, hunters became uneasy. Not trusting a department that had traditionally placed sheep at a low management priority, the public thought it should direct management. Sheep hunters began to worry that there were fewer sheep and that hunting conditions would surely deteriorate. What they hadn't noticed was that hunter numbers were declining with, or maybe even faster than the sheep populations. Much of this had to do with federal land classifications that I've reported on ad nauseum in these proceedings. Hunter numbers decreased by about half over 15 years between land classifications and the presumption there was more hunter demand than resource supply. Now, Alaska hunting has always been driven by hunter gossip. This effectively set the stage for the Great Resident Hunter Revolt against non-residents and their required guide outfitters. This revolt began over 82 hours, 82 gallons of aviation fuel, avgas. A single hunter who was familiar with the management system and public regulatory process flew his Super Cub into the North Wrangell Mountains and stashed 82 gallons of avgas to use when he got back there to sheep hunt. His avgas was gone when he got back. He figured, probably correctly, it had been found, stolen, and combusted in the local guide's Super Cub. That guide lived year-round in the mountains and had a reputation for being territorial. The aggrieved hunter then began a crusade against guides under the guise of restricting non-resident sheep hunters who must have a guide in Alaska. He and a few friends began to bury the regulatory board with proposals to disadvantage non-resident hunters, really their guides. Not wanting to tell the local activists to find something else to do, the board, which is built to respond to public opinion, got the department to fund a facilitated working group to draft new management plans. By then, our 36-year-old plans had been either so good or so forgettable that virtually nobody but I even remembered we had them. The would-be managers, not the professionals, thought management planning was the way to achieve their goals in policy change. And they got the department to fund a facilitated working group of approximately 40 people. That effort failed, partly because as it got underway, the department realized it couldn't spend obligated Pittman-Robertson fundings for planning, and partly because existing management plans were discovered. The management planners of the day, the modern ones, had made sure every possible affected interest was represented in the group. That's why it was so big. We had everything from the Amateur Pilots Association to anti-hunters to guides in the tourism industry. This meeting dissolved in acrimony. In the end, nobody but the influential Wild Sheep Foundation, which like many NGOs may sometimes think of itself as the manager, depending on its leadership. Nobody really wanted a standard sheep management plan with population objectives that was impossible to maintain, harvest goals that were wildly variable, and arbitrary metrics of success. The department resisted that approach to rewriting management plans, although that's what it usually likes, but promised to review the existing plans, which are experience for hunters based, when federal aid management reports were due every few years. That kind of solved that problem, but the Board of Games still had about 100 proposals to disadvantage non-residents. None of them made any biological, managerial, or fiscal sense, but the board seemed to think it owed something to the activists. During yet another hunter attitude survey, it was pretty much agreed that hunters on the ground didn't want to see airplanes flying around spooking the sheep they were stalking. So the board passed a regulation saying spotting sheep to hunt from an airplane was illegal. Now, please recall that the private aircraft pilots had been part of the failed working group. Consequently, they were keeping an eye on the system. When the board banned their traditional activity, they were so highly annoyed and motivated that they formed their own NGO, the Resident Hunters of Alaska, their goal being to disadvantage non-resident hunters and guides. The private aircraft industry or users included many doctors and lawyers who had enough money to hire an aggressive executive director, keep agitating to disadvantage hunters and guides, non-resident hunters and guides. Now the Board of Game has to deal with special interest proposals to disadvantage guides and non-resident hunters on a regular basis, just as it has always dealt with the special interest of guides and outfitters. This may or may not make constitutional or economic sense. The resident hunters of Alaska seem to have given up on the aircraft spotting ban that caused them to form, and now they focus primarily on things like litigating resident preference and trophy hunting of brown bears on federal lands on Kodiak Island. It's not simple. The other story I have for you is the Alaska MOV story. This starts with you scaring the pants off all of us in Alaska about MOV. In Alaska, we've had no documented all-age die-offs we can blame on disease, and nobody wants to see that happen. With realization that MOV can spread to wild sheep, possibly our disease-naive Dall sheep, folks began to be concerned about possible exposure to MOV in Alaska. The common assumption was that our sheep had never seen MOV. This concern manifested itself in two ways. The professionals began a survey of Alaskan wildlife to see what we already had. The department planned to take action once the definable threat either had or wasn't going to occur. It began an MOV survey that we've heard about several times in this symposium already. Apparently, Alaska has a unique strain of MOV in Dall sheep, caribou, and goats that doesn't seem to compromise Alaska wildlife health at the present. Unfortunately, the Alaska chapter of the Wild Sheep Foundation had neither been aware of this survey or considered it insufficiently protective. Consequently, the Alaska chapter went to the Board of Game, that outfit that's built to respond to public activity, with a simple proposal to remove Dall sheep from the Board of Game's clean list. Now, the Board of Game is charged with conservation as well as allocation, and part of its conservation function has been to try and cut red tape by establishing a list of game type animals you can import without a permit. The Alaska chapter didn't realize that domestic sheep and goats, while somehow on the clean list, could not be regulated by the Board of Game. But they didn't tell the folks who are very interested in wild sheep or in domestic sheep and goats that they were going to try and regulate their activities. This is not so much a matter of these domestic growers being a major industry in Alaska as that it's not just your sheep or your goat, it's your freedom in the Alaska ethic. So what these domestic keepers did was organize their own resistance through their own special interest group, an NGO called the Alaska Farm Bureau. They then got into it with the Alaska chapter, and another working group was called. This one was primarily driven by the Alaska Foundation chapter. And in that failed meeting, it was shown that the Board of Game had no authority to regulate domestic animals. Their responsibility falls with the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation, where Alaska State Veterinarian is administratively housed. The Board of Game, which had been asked to control imports, had no authority because domestic animals aren't game. In spite of the general failure of this second Alaska WSF orchestrated meeting, negotiations between the Department of Fish and Game and the Department of Environmental Conservation have resulted in draft regulations that would basically give the Alaska chapter everything it wanted, but through proper channels. Regulations will call for testing for standard MOV with positivity defined at 50% inhibition prior to import. Positive domestic sheep and goats will not be allowed. Thus, also the draft regulations call for making MOV a reportable disease and permanent identification of all imported domestic sheep and goat. Sounds great. However, realizing that everything is caused by something, I think that to save face, the state vet's office provided domestic growers with an exception based on preliminary data from several years ago for lambs and kids under 2 months of age. From what we know now, this won't work biologically. This provision, not having a biological basis, may be changed. There's been lots of public comment on it, and it may be that we'll see required testing for all domestic sheep and goats for import. I'm gratified in this symposium to see the success that some of you are having with lethal removal of foraying or invading bighorn sheep. Surprisingly to me, the domestic growers were very much in favor of that. That was kind of surprising because I thought they were supposed to be the bad people. The really surprising thing was they insisted on reciprocal lethal removal of any domestic sheep and goats that seemed to be encroaching on the wild sheep habitats. I argue these stories show that management of wild sheep and goats in Alaska is a lot more complex than gathering data, interpreting them in the light of public opinion, and making regulations that appear to make sense to special interests. It's a rough and tumble business. Those of you that are hoping to get into wildlife management need to be aware that this is a rough and tumble business and how it is we got to where we are. If we know that, we might have better success as managers. Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. If anyone has any questions, there's the little Q&A tab at the bottom of your page. Very interesting history. I'm
kind of sorry for reading it, but my memory isn't what it used to be.
Let's see, we have a question. from Bill Jex. He says that the Alaskan Archives document some domestic sheep and Dall's sheep. There were even successful attempts to hybridize the two. It is possible that the unique historic MOV strain and its effects have long since run their course, and thus the early post contacts are lost to history as wild sheep were simply not inventoried back at the start of the 1900s.
That's correct, Bill. Our friend Joe Want has done a pretty extensive review. Over the last century, there have been thousands of domestic sheep imported. Some of them, perhaps more than 1,000 or so, were trailed right through Dall sheep habitat in the Alaska range. We also have MOV in places where we wouldn't expect there have ever been any domestic sheep or goats. It's possible they could have brought the MOV over from Asia, with migration across Beringia. Nobody knows. The story of hybridization is a fascinating one. And I would refer you to Joe Want, who may be talking about or maybe listening today for that detail.
Any other questions for Wayne? Okay, thank you very much, Wayne.